When I first started studying Mandarin about 7 years ago as a freshman in college, I didn't know anything. I was starting from square one. I remember for college, during freshman orientation, we had to take a language placement exam, which is what they used to figure out what level of a language class you're supposed to go into. And seeing as how I didn't even know how to write my own name, let alone answer any of the questions on there,
You failed.
I was obviously placed in beginner one. Since then, I've gone from not knowing anything at all to having lived abroad in Taiwan, where I spent months speaking nothing but Chinese and making YouTube videos in Chinese as well. So along the way, learned a lot of lessons, made a lot of mistakes, and in this video I want to talk about 3 of the biggest mistakes that I made that hopefully you can learn from and maybe not make those same mistakes. Okay, so diving right into it, the first mistake that I made was not having clear goals. So when I went into studying Mandarin as a freshman in college, I didn't really think about what I wanted to do with the language. The biggest things for me, 1, I had to knock out this foreign language requirement that we had to do, and 2, just trying to do well in class. So while grades can be a very strong motivator, they're very limiting for a couple of reasons. 1, if you're self-studying, then grades really just don't apply at all. You can't rely on an external metric to help you stay motivated in that sense, and you can't rely on having a teacher or other classmates to keep pushing you if you're self-studying.
Pass or fail on your own.
The second thing is, even if you're at school, grades don't always work. Because for me, I remember back during my first or second year studying Mandarin, every time we'd go for winter break or summer break, I would come back and I would feel a lot rustier than prior to the break. So I remember like my freshman year, we had summer break, it was 3 months, and then I came back for my second year and I had forgotten a lot of what I'd learned that first year. And I know that's definitely on me for not studying during that break period, but I think a big part of why I didn't do that was because I felt like I didn't have any reason to, I didn't have any motivation to, because my goals were really doing well in class, and I didn't have class, and there wasn't something else that I was trying to reach towards. And I think having clearer goals at the time, or at least being a little more intentional about while I was studying Mandarin, could have helped me to, 1, definitely retain material a bit better, but also 2, make a little more progress and continue to study even when I didn't have class. Later on, when I was thinking about taking a gap year and studying in Taiwan, I made sure to really sit out and write out my goals because I wanted to be really intentional about what I wanted to accomplish during my time there. Now, the goals ranged from like really far-reaching to goals that I wanted to hit in the small term. The main thing was to make sure I had milestones that weren't tied to how well I did in class. One example of that was learning how to read a restaurant menu in Chinese, or learning how to watch a Chinese show entirely without relying on English subtitles, being able to go on a date or speak with a native speaker for multiple hours. These range from small goals like the ones I just mentioned of learning how to read a newspaper article to much larger goals as well of not trying to translate at all. And I think that one definitely took a lot more time, but it was something that once it happened was a milestone that, made me really happy. I was like, wow, this was something that I set out to do when I got here, and I was able to do that. The second big mistake that I made was thinking that progress is linear and then getting really frustrated when I thought I wasn't improving. I think this applies both if you're studying Mandarin in a school setting and if you're studying Mandarin by yourself. This might seem a little counterintuitive or contrast the previous point about having clear goals, but I think even with clear goals, it's sometimes really hard to see if you're improving in a short-term, kind of week-to-week basis. And I think the reason for that is, especially just from my own personal experience, when learning Mandarin, you're learning a lot of vocabulary words. In week 1, I'm just making this number up, but let's say you're learning 20 or 40 different words, and then by week 2, you're learning an entirely different set of words. And so I remember finding it frustrating when it felt like because we were sometimes going so fast, I didn't actually retain the stuff that I had learned before. So while, numerically we were making progress, we're now in lesson 2 versus lesson 1.
But what am I concentrating on?
Personally, it was just really difficult sometimes to figure out if I was actually making progress or if I was just cramming information and then forgetting it and not really using it. This is something that I've also experienced after coming back to the United States. So I remember when I was living in Taiwan, during one of my last months there, I remember talking to my teacher and saying, it's going to be really shitty when I come back to the US and I'm not going to be able to have this environment anymore where I can speak Mandarin all the time and my Mandarin is just going to get worse. And her response was just very matter of fact. It's like, yeah, of course it is. You're coming from an environment where you're speaking Mandarin all the time, you're taking classes, and it's just all around you to a place in the United States where you're going to be using English all the time again. You're not going to have that language immersion environment, so it's not realistic to think that your progress is going to be the same. And I think that was something that I knew, but that I still struggled with when I first got back. I still found it really frustrating that I wasn't making the same progress that I was before. And I think a lot of that time could have probably been more productively used if I had used it to study more or watch more Chinese shows instead of just feeling frustrated and not doing anything about it. In these moments of frustration, I try to remind myself of two things. One, just like my teacher said, it's not realistic to compare my Taiwan language learning environment to the environment that I have now, and to compare the language learning progress between those two. The second thing is that this is something that everyone experiences, especially if they've lived abroad and then come back to whatever country they're from, and that basically I just have to judge myself less, because that can actually get in the way of making progress. The final mistake that I made was not getting language immersion earlier on. So when I was studying Mandarin in school, we were primarily focusing on, what we learned in textbooks, what we learned in the classroom. So sometimes we would have skits and we would definitely have language practice, but that was all within the context of this kind of safe language learning environment.
See, I'm still in training, but...
By immersion, I mean trying to take in native inputs. So things like watching Chinese shows or watching Chinese YouTube videos or even listening to podcasts. And I think the mistake that I made was thinking that at a beginner level, there wouldn't be anything within a native language that would make sense for me to watch. Basically, I thought everything out there would be too difficult and that it would be a waste of my time to watch it. And so because of that, for the first maybe 2 years that I studied Mandarin, I didn't really watch anything. So outside of the time I spent in class or the time that I spent with my classmates, I didn't really use Mandarin or hear it in a native context. I think that was a really big mistake because there are actually a lot of really good materials, let's call them, videos, shows out there that are still comprehensible at a beginner level. I think one of those is a show that I watched a couple episodes of called Baba Chu Nar. It's this kind of reality TV show that's lighthearted where dads take their kids off to rural places in China and then they have to do a bunch of activities and trivia things together. It's really cute, it's really simple also because it's mostly dads communicating with their children and children don't use very complex language. In addition to that, there are also animes that are dubbed over in Chinese. Anime is a bit of an interesting one. If you already watch it in Japanese, then you know that the plot lines can sometimes be very formulaic, it's very plot heavy, depending on what you watch. But if you're watching a Chinese dubbed anime, especially for a show that you've already watched before, then you don't need to pay as much attention to the plot points, the details, and you also have a lot of visual information that helps you to figure out what people are saying. And I think that's really important because while in the classroom we're emphasizing individual words, individual phrases, and really focusing on the details of what we're saying, when you're watching a show and when you're trying to do immersion, I think what's really important is not really focusing on the specifics, but trying to understand the main ideas that people are talking about, kind of 80% of the main idea. And anime and shows like Baba Chu Nar, where there are a lot of visuals, really help to tell that story so you can figure out what's going on. Alright, so that's it for today's video about 3 mistakes that I made while studying Mandarin. I hope you found these mistakes helpful to learn from, and if you catch yourself making these mistakes, remind yourself that it's okay, and don't be too hard on yourself, because if you're taking the time to learn and you're putting in the effort, it's gonna pay off.